So, thank you, Professor Murphy. First of all, I would like to say that it's a great pleasure to be here. It's my first time in Budapest, and to be among such fine scholars as yourself, and thank you for being here. You'll notice that this presentation may appear less conventionally scientific, and I want to say up front that is intentional, because when studying children burials on the Roman frontier, especially in places like Scythia, we're not working with a complete or coherent record. It is partial, it is scattered, and shaped by long-term neglect. So what you'll see here is not a deficit of ambition, but a refusal to bypass foundational questions. What do we actually know? Where does the record begin and end? And what kind of analysis is responsible at this stage? Just want to move to the next one. Okay, so here is how I've structured things. We start with the context, both historical and geographical, then look at the history of funerary research and what has been excavated. From there, I'll move to child-specific data, including my own case studies. I'll end out by outlining the limitations of the record and, of course, a proposal to think or rethink how we engage with this material. Scythia was a Roman province in late antiquity, roughly covering what is today Dobroja region, the region between the Danube and the Black Sea, now split between Romania and Bulgaria. It was carved out of Moesia Inferior province during the administrative reforms of Emperor Diocletian towards the end of the 3rd century. Its cities reflect this layered history. The coastal settlements like Tomis, Callatis, and Histria were originally Greek foundations, while the Danube frontier hosted newer Roman military and civilian sites. From the 3rd century AD onward, the region came under increasing pressure from Germanic group migrating southward, part of the broader instability along the northern frontier of the Roman Empire. By the 7th century, the province was in steep decline until it had effectively collapsed by the end of the century. Throughout the 4th to 7th centuries, Scythia functioned as a true borderland, a multi-ethnic militarized zone marked by alternating episodes of violence, diplomacy, and exchange. So to understand the data set I'm working with, we need to look at how it came into being. Let's now look at the timeline of funerary research across the province, focusing on the key sites marked on the map. The earliest known graves were uncovered at Tomis, modern-day Constanța, during port construction at the end of the 19th century. These were incidental finds, not part of an archaeological project, and little to no documentation survives. Large-scale excavations began only in the 1950s, and they expanded rapidly from that point onward. At Tomis, over 500 graves were excavated between 1959 and 1964. At Callatis, the record is even more extensive. So we have up to date more than 1,000 graves uncovered at this site. Beroe, another key site, yielded over 1,000 graves, but dating from the 2nd to the 30th century. Through the documentation is notoriously inconsistent, and many skeletal remains are disconnected from excavation data. Now, despite the hundreds or even thousands of graves excavated across the region, only 3 monographs have ever been published that systematically present the findings from a major cemetery in this region, just 3. So we have the first one of Callatis, Preda's volume from the 1980, covering roughly 360 burials. The second one from 1987 works on Beroe. Many of the associated finds and skeletons were mismatched or renumbered, making full anthropological interpretation difficult. And finally, my own contribution from 3 years ago, based on my PhD, on the cemeteries of Histria, covering around 240 burials from the 1st to the 7th centuries AD. If we shift our focus from funerary archaeology in general to children specifically, Romanian scholarship has very rarely treated children as a distinct subject of archaeological inquiry. The number of focus studies is remarkably small, and most of them remain preliminary in scope. Both studies point to several core issues. The first one, the uneven nature of the data, both in terms of how much information is available and the quality of the information. The description of the graves and the skeletal material are often sparse, laconic, and lacking the details we would need for proper analysis. And the second one, this study highlights the absence of real interdisciplinary collaborations. Too often, the osteological analysis is done in isolation, without input from archaeologists familiar with the context, or vice versa. What's missing is a truly integrated approach, one that brings together the biological and the archaeological perspective to tell a fuller story. Moving on to my own research, in recent years, I've tried to address this gap directly through two focused case studies that deal specifically with the mortuary treatment of children. The first was published while I was still a PhD student in 2018 and focuses on Histria. This article set out to test long-standing assumptions derived from literary sources that children were socially marginal and, as a result, excluded from former funerary practice. What I found instead, through a close reading of the archaeological record, was quite the opposite. Children were not excluded. They were buried in comparable ways to adults in similar locations with similar materials. The funerary treatment shows no signs of social neglect. My second study, published in 2023, looks at the site of Ibida. I was able to conduct a detailed comparison between adult and child burials using anthropological data and archaeological variables, such as location, grave architecture, body orientation, and presence of grave goods. The result was again clear. Children were not treated differently than adults. Their graves do not signal a lower social investment or ritual neglect. I actually presented this paper at the SSCIP conference in Buenos Aires. It was 3 years ago. So these two studies offer an empirical basis to rethink not just childhood in Roman Scythia, but also our assumptions about marginality and visibility in the archaeological record. Just to sum it up, at Ibida, the dataset includes 82 adult and 41 non-adult individuals, with an additional vaulted tomb containing the remains of at least 27 people, including 10 children. At Histria, the sample is even more substantial. We have 116 adults and 73 non-adults. These numbers are important not only because they allow for comparative analysis, but because they show just how visible children actually are in this funerary context, at least in terms of burial frequency. In both sides, children make up a significant proportion of the sample. Now moving on to the challenges of working with this material remain serious, actually. First, the documentation is often inconsistent or fragmentary. Some graves were never fully recorded, actually. Others are listed in reports, but without plans, photographs, or skeletal details. We also see erratic grave numbering system. In some sectors, the numbering resets each year, or worse, is duplicated across different sectors. This makes long-term tracking nearly impossible. Stratigraphic ambiguity is also another recurring issue because excavations in the 50s and the 70s rarely prioritized vertical sequencing, at least in Romania, which undermines our ability to reconstruct site chronology with confidence. Even when skeletal material survives, it has often been separated from its original context or transferred to anthropology labs with no linking documentation. And where the funerary data has been published, it's often within a descriptive framework with little attempt to ask broader questions about identity, memory, or social meaning. Lastly, the adoption of interdisciplinary methods has been delayed in this region, partly due to infrastructure, but also due to lack of prioritization. These challenges don't make the research impossible, but they do require a different approach, one that is slow, synthetic, and honest about what the data can and cannot say. Everything I've shown so far points to a deeper problem, one that goes beyond individual graves or isolated data sets. What we're dealing with, actually, it's a structural neglect in scholarship, a combination of practical, linguistic, and institutional factors that has systematically marginalized this region and this subject in particular. First, there's the underrepresentation of the region itself. Second, we face language and publication barriers. Much of the work that does exist is published only in national languages, in local journals maybe, and remains absent from international bibliographies, academic databases, and major syntheses. Even English language studies, as the one I've showed you before, from this region, are frequently overlooked. Third, the data is often inaccessible and fragmented. There is no shared database, no integrated resource. And finally, there are serious gaps in synthesis and comparison. Even excellent local studies remain isolated, rarely brought into dialogue with each other or with broader scholarship. Everything I've outlined so far leads to this, the need for a project that doesn't just analyze, but that rebuilds the record. I actually started my own database back in 2019 while I was a Fulbright visiting student at the University of Florida in Gainesville. My approach is not about jumping directly into interpretation or importing external methods. It's about doing the foundational work first, what I call a sort of recursive archaeology. This is an approach where practice is iterative and reflexive, and where the path to understanding is built step by step. On the first pass, the goal is to identify and clarify the data set, which burials are available, what is actually documented, what can be reliably compared. On the second pass, the aim is to organize and structure the material, test its consistency, and understand its internal logic. Only after that comes the interpretive phase, one that engages theoretical frameworks, cross-regional comparison, and deeper questions of identity, memory, social structure, and so on. This may seem like a slower path, especially in a field that increasingly celebrates analytical sophistication and digital tools, but I would argue that this isn't a dated approach, it is a responsible one. Before we apply analytics, we need to lay the groundwork. We cannot theorize from absence. We must begin with visibility and with structure. Thank you for your attention and enjoy your coffee.